No, thank you, Sue. Well, our scripture reading this morning is from Mark 12:38 to 44. Let us hear the word of the Lord. As he taught, he said, "Beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes, and to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces, and to have the best seats in the synagogues and places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses, and for the sake of appearance say long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation." He sat down opposite the treasury and watched the crowd putting money into the treasury, and many rich people put in large sums. And a poor widow came and put in 2 small copper coins, which are worth a penny. Then he called his disciples and said to them, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the treasury. For all of them have contributed out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, has put in everything she had, all she had to live on." Thanks be to God for this reading. So at first glance, in a casual reading of this passage, and we might say, hey, what a great passage to use for a stewardship campaign on sacrificial giving. We could keep that passage up there. We could take the bulletin cover and blow it up and put it on an easel here of this widow dropping in 2 coins. And we could reference it and say, hey, if she can do this, certainly we can, folks. We just need to give more. Well, I think we may be squirming in our seats a little bit with that, because the United Methodists usually don't try for those high-pressure tactics when it comes to giving. Now, make no mistake, our church needs money just like any other church. As much as I consider this church a spiritual opportunity center, I also know that we have expenses. We have expenses just for the building, we have expenses for salaries, we have expenses for utilities, and general wear and tear and upkeep, as Al knows and Verley knows as well. As well, this building serves a purpose. It's to welcome all through our doors, and certainly to equip them with God's love and God's mercy and God's grace, and to go out into our community, to our church family that awaits outside of these doors, in our community, in our country, and in our world. But to use this passage and to say that this widow is a symbol of generosity, that may be a little bit of a stretch. I think this passage can be used for a sacrificial giving, a stewardship campaign for that, and I think this widow serves as a symbol. I just think we have to make sure we know what that symbol is. So let's look into this chapter of Mark 12:38 to 44 and see what it has to say. And as usual, most of the time we just can't read that block of passage. We have to see what comes before it, see what comes after it to get into the proper framework, the context of what they're trying to say. And this one's no different, because this one actually doesn't start talking about the widow. It starts talking with a warning. Beware. Beware of the scribes and the Pharisees. Now, if you read a little bit earlier in Mark, Jesus is really railing against these scribes and Pharisees because they have become corrupt. They, along with, again, the Pharisees and the high priests, make up the religious community, the religious establishment. But somewhere along the way, they've become corrupt. Jesus has used parables to his disciples telling about all of this corruption that they have. If you read Matthew 23, you'll get quite a long dissertation of Jesus saying the 7 woes of the scribes and the Pharisees, calling them hypocrites and other harsh language, saying they're like whitewashed tombs, nice on the outside, but dead bones on the inside. Yikes. And this one is no different. He starts right off with a warning. Now, what's setting him off on these scribes and Pharisees? Well, for one thing, he doesn't like it because they're wearing their long white robes outside into the marketplaces. They're just supposed to wear them in the synagogues teaching. But now they've taken to wearing them out in the marketplaces just for prestigious purposes and for status. And if they consult with somebody, it's like they want some contribution for their services. He doesn't like it that they are reciting long prayers, not for the sake of God, but for the sake of looking holy. And he doesn't like it that they're taking God's laws and breaking them down into sub-laws, which put more and more and more pressure on God's people. But what he really doesn't like is the corruption that they use to fleece the poor, especially the poor widows. Now, it's no secret that in biblical times that the male was the predominant breadwinner in the family. The wife did what she could to supplement that pay, but if the husband passed away, the widow really had no source of income, and she had to rely on the inheritance of her husband. But these scribes and Pharisees would then use their intelligence, they would use their interpretations of the law and their legal recourse to come in and fleece these widows out of this money, basically leaving them to eke out an existence day to day just for basic survival. It's no wonder that Jesus said he's going to leave his greatest condemnation for these scribes and Pharisees. So maybe the first symbol that we should look at when we think about this widow is not one of generosity, but one of oppression. So the widow comes to the marketplace, to the temple, and there she encounters 13 collection offering bins. They're kind of a metal-shaped, trumpet-shaped device. And they're there so that when you put in money, you're going to certainly make and hear noise of that. When the rich put in a lot of money, boy, it made a lot of noise. And the scribes knew this, so they would often take their money and cash it in for more money. So you would take like 50 or 4 50-cent pieces and break it down into quarters, dimes, nickels, and pennies. So when you poured it in, it would have maximum effect and everybody would look at it. But these 13 collection plates were there for many different types of offerings. You had guilt offerings, you had numerous sin offerings, you had tax offerings, and you had voluntary offerings. So the widow comes to the temple and she drops in 2 coins. Now we immediately might say, well, why didn't she just drop in 1 coin and keep the other coin? Why'd she put in both? Well, you kind of had to understand the value of money in biblical times. There were many different types of coins. There were Greek and Roman and Jewish coins, and one of the ones that we might know of the most was the denarius that had a picture of Caesar on it. In fact, in an earlier passage, Jesus makes reference to the picture on the coin. Give Caesar what is Caesar's and give God's what is God's. But there were other coins as well, the drachma, the assarion, the shekel, the quadrant, the farthing, and what they called a lepta or a lepton. And the lepton was about equal to a penny. So the widow dropped in 2 pennies. Now we might think about why she put in 2 coins then. Well, really, how insignificant have pennies become today? If you're short one at Casey's, never mind, I got one right here. You might see them on the streets or on the sidewalks as well. Again, they've become somewhat insignificant. In fact, the people that used to collect out of these bins used to not even like to count the lepta because they were just so insignificant. They were a nuisance to try to sort out and add up. So really, what is the widow going to live on if she puts in 1 penny? What can you buy for a penny nowadays? So the second symbol we might think of when we think of this widow is one of poverty. Now my view of poverty has changed over the years. Growing up, and my mom and dad came through the Depression, they said, well, nobody had any money. Everybody was poor. And as I grew up, I guess I didn't really notice a lot of difference with my friends and the clothes they wore or the houses that we had. Nobody had any air conditioning or color TV or cable or any of that. I think my first view of those less fortunate is we grew up right next to a Chicago Northwestern railroad track. And sometimes the train would stop and we'd have what we called hobos at the time that would come out and look for a sandwich or a handout. It was a Hispanic family that just lived a block up from me, 7 of them in a 1 one-story building about the size of a garage, no basement. I played with and went to school with their son Mario. As I grew up, it was my wife, my girlfriend first, then who became my wife, who through her and her sister grew up in a single-parent household with no child support. And she went to work at a very young age because she was too embarrassed to use food stamps. As I moved to Dallas, I worked on the east side, which was a very high crime rate area. Used to drive on Hampton Road past an area called the Projects every day, a very low income and poverty-stricken area. We had homeless sleeping on the backside of our building and in the vacant lot right next to us. And if you'd leave Dallas at dusk, it wasn't surprising to see droves of people heading toward the underpasses to find shelter for the night. And on our subsequent visits to other countries, certainly you see people eking out an existence day to day to day, just for basic survival. And now with the hurricanes and the fires that we're seeing, with homes and businesses wiped out, that ever-widening gap between the haves and the have-nots is increasing. I appreciate Dave mentioning about his homeless project here, and as well I heard in Nubo that they were having an excursion this weekend where you could sleep in vehicles to get kind of an idea, just one glimpse of an idea what it's like to be homeless. The homeless and the oppressed and the poor all around us, if we take notice. And in this passage, somebody did. When the woman comes to give her 2 coins, she's almost as insignificant as the coins that she drops in. Nobody notices her except one person. And that person was Jesus. Now he not only notices that she comes to the temple, but he not only notices that she drops in her 2 coins, but he notices that she drops in all that she had. Now only through his power, his omniscience, would he be able to realize that she didn't have anything else in her bag. That was it. She gave literally everything. So are we to think that Jesus is happy about this? Are we thinking that Jesus is praising the woman for doing this, that she is a symbol of generosity? Is that what Jesus wants us to do, is to give all of our money? I hardly think so. I think if you read in the context of this passage, Jesus isn't happy about it. He doesn't praise the woman, he just notices that all that she gave. He notices that she literally gave everything that she had. And again, he's not happy. She's giving charity to the church, where this church is supposed to give charity to her. Paul mentions in the book of Timothy, he outlines all that's supposed to happen to widows in that time. It depended upon if the widow was young, if family was near or far away, if she had children, if the widow was older, if she had grandchildren. But the church was supposed to take care of the widows. So Jesus is not happy. As much as anything else, he sees this widow as a victim of the times, a victim of the religious establishment. So the third symbol we can certainly look at this widow as is a victim. So that certainly gives us recourse on giving, doesn't it? We can give to the oppressed, we can give to the poor, we can give to those who are victims. But it didn't explain something to me. Why did the widow give? Why did she give? Why did she come to a temple that Jesus said was corrupt, where he drove the money changers and overturned the tables out of the temple? And in chapter 13, very next chapter up, the disciples and Jesus are walking away from the temple, and the disciples are marveling at the beautiful stone and the architecture of the temple. And Jesus just shakes his head and says, no, this temple will fall. And 2 years later, the Romans came in and destroyed it. Why would she come to a temple amidst those scribes and Pharisees that fleeced her out of her money? And why would she drop her coins in? Her last 2 coins, where she would have to fast the rest of the day, and who knows what tomorrow would bring. Well, I think she represents one last symbol. There's a story about a 34-year-old man who's celebrating his birthday. He's got a wife and a 4-year-old son. His wife gives him a present and a card, very nice, very appreciative. And his little 4-year-old boy said, "Just a minute." He runs to his room and he comes back and he has a card that has like "Dad" written in crayon and "I love you" on the inside, and a little box. And his dad opens up the box and there's a baggie full of 80 pennies. Now his little boy didn't break his bank to do that, he just threw in money. But the little boy doesn't know if there's 80 cents in there or $8 or $80. But money isn't the point of the story. The point of the story is that the little boy gave his dad everything that he possibly could, everything that a 4-year-old boy could. He gave him his joy, his merriment, his glee, his excitement, his presence, his bounciness, his love. The little boy gave him everything. What if this passage isn't strictly about money? When Jesus said that she gave everything she had, maybe he wasn't just talking about the 2 coins. What if she came because of her joy, because of her trust, because of her faith, and gave her bounciness and her presence, everything that she had that day, she gave to God. Regardless of how corrupt the temple was, or the scribes or the Pharisees, she gave to God. It was intent. What would our church look like if we gave out of joy? Well, we'd probably have a stewardship campaign that would be on sacrificial giving every year, but no longer would it be such a pain point or a sore subject or a burden or a negative. We might give out of joy and have abundance to where we could direct this money towards something good, maybe like a homeless project. To say that when people look at the Solon United Methodist Church, there's the symbol that I want to be. There's what I think of them to be. For the longest time it used to be football dinners, but those are gone. So what is the Solon United Methodist Church going to look at as a symbol moving forward? What could we put our money towards? Think about the joy we would have of celebrating as a positive rather than a negative. If we couldn't give monetarily, think about the volunteer pool we might have. Hey, I don't have a lot of money to give, but I'll be glad to join a committee, or I'll be glad to help on an excursion or an activity. We would have such a list rather than trying to find members for committees saying, well, how long a commitment was that again? Is that like 2 years or 3 years? If we couldn't join voluntarily because of schedules, think of other things we could use, our gifts, our talents. Or what resources do we have at home? Or contacts that we know that might help the church in their mission. Rather than giving out of obligation or need or burden, we would give out of joy for all the blessings that God has bestowed upon us. That would be much better. So how do we capture that feeling? How do we capture that bounciness, that joy of that 4-year-old, or the joy that the widow brought to the temple and her giving? Well, that's a journey that we all must take. There's one last story about a Peruvian woman that was working in a village. It's a pretty big touristy area right next to the mountains. And every morning she would go up into the mountains to the stream and grab a bucket of water so that she could keep it by her stand to kind of cool off while she worked during the day. But this time when she went up to the stream, she saw something kind of shining in the water. And she reached down and picked up looked like a gemstone, like an opal, very pinkish hue. She was enamored with the sparkling that it made. So she took it back down to her village and kept it by her stand. As tourists came through, there was a hiking expedition that came through that was going up into the mountains. And one man happened to see the sunshine kind of hitting this gemstone, and he walked over and he says, "It's really nice." He goes, "Is that for sale?" And she just said no. He says, "Well, can I have it?" And she smiled and she grabbed the stone and she handed it to him. He started to back away and he started walking with his friends. He says, "I don't think she realized what she had. I could probably sell this for a couple $1,000s. And off they went up into the hills. But the next day he came back down and he found the woman at her stand and he handed it back to her. And she looked puzzled. And he says, "I don't need that." He says, what I need is that which allowed you to give that to me in the first place, without hesitation, without question, and without regret. What I've been searching for is that joy in giving. I think more than anything else, maybe that's what this passage is about. Sure, she's a symbol of oppression, of poverty, she's a victim, but I also think maybe that she's a symbol of what starts with the heart. Rather than giving out of obligation or out of need or out of burden, out of a negative, she gave out of her joy, out of her trust, out of her faith in God. I think she is a symbol of that joy in giving. And I think that's something that we all search for. There's one quote that I think sums it up the best. We make a living by what we get. We make a life by what we give. In His name we pray. Amen.